Today we're going to be talking about how historians study history. And what we're going to see is that historians use a variety of sources to answer questions about the past. And specifically, they're going to use primary and secondary sources in their research. So the first thing that we have to define is primary source. What is a primary source? A primary source is going to be a first-hand or eyewitness account of an event. So this is going to be a person that was actually there. They experienced the event. So these are going to be actual records that have survived from the past. So some examples: letters, photographs, clothing, paintings, pottery, things like that. Another example is, let's say a person was in a car accident. This is going to be the person or the people that were in the car accident. These are going to be the people that witnessed the car accident, that type of thing. Next, secondary sources are another tool that are used by historians. Secondary sources are second-hand records of what happened. These are people that did not experience the event, and they're going to be written after the event. So an example is your textbook. So the textbook is research that different people have compiled about different topics. However, you will see that your textbook does contain, in certain places, excerpts of primary sources, so they might contain a couple lines from a historical document or a poem, things like that. And in that scenario that I just talked about with the car accident, the secondary source might be the newspaper that published what happened in the car accident the next day. They might include, again, excerpts of witnesses, but the person that would be writing it didn't experience the event. Maybe they weren't there at all. And just a word of caution about the textbook. I know it's really tempting as a student to think that all the answers are found in the book, but in just relying solely on the book and never turning to primary sources, you're a passive recipient of knowledge versus an active participant in reconstructing what's going on in history. So basically, you're taking someone else's word for it instead of digging into it and seeing what happened for yourself and coming up with your own interpretations. So some ways that we can use the textbook or use secondary sources in general: we can turn to them as a source of facts. So for example, if you need to look up when was the cotton gin invented, you might look in your book or you might just Google it and find a secondary source. Secondary sources are also good for providing background information. So let's say you had to write about Martin Luther's 95 Theses and you needed some background information on what was going on in the Catholic Church at the time and what was going on in the Renaissance to help you understand Martin Luther and why he wrote that. Another way that secondary sources are useful is to give us an interpretation of what's going on in history. So that might just be one perspective on the issue. So not to say that we shouldn't use secondary sources, just that we shouldn't rely solely on secondary sources. Now we're going to move into a time of practice, classifying primary versus secondary sources. So there are 8 examples, and I want you to write down your answers as you see the example flashed on the screen. And you can just write P for primary, S for secondary, and if you miss it, that's totally fine. Just make sure that you cross out the wrong answer and write the right answer. That way I just get a sense for which ones you missed and things like that. So the question, are the following primary or secondary sources? Again, you're going to classify with P for primary or S for secondary. So the first one is your textbook. Now, we've been talking about the textbook. Hopefully you get this one, so take a moment to think about that. So if you said secondary, then you are correct. Alright, next one. Your driver's license. this primary or secondary? This one's going to be primary because you were there, you experienced the event, they had to get your picture, your information. Next, your diary. Is this primary or secondary? Or this could also be a historical diary. Primary or secondary? This is going to be primary because the author did experience the event. Next, a letter written by Mrs. Weber. I'm sorry if that's cut off a little bit. Again, that's letter written by Mrs. Weber. Is this primary or secondary? This is going to be primary because I wrote it. I experienced the events. Next, an autobiography. So this is written by the person about their experiences. This is an example of the book Night. I think that you'll be reading it in the 10th grade. This is an example of a primary source. Again, the person wrote this. They were there. Next, a biography. So this is written about a person. So they're studying a person's life and writing about the experiences that that person had. So this is going to be a secondary source because the person writing the book did not experience the events. They're making their own interpretations on another person's life. Next one, encyclopedia. I know these are outdated. Maybe you've never seen encyclopedias. Think book version of Wikipedia. So that's going to be secondary. Again, it contains topics on things from now, from the past, and the person that compiled this information was not there, so secondary. Next, Declaration of Independence. So a historical document, primary or secondary, and this is our last example. Alright, if you said primary, you are correct. Now, the last thing that I would like for you to jot down in your notes is take a few moments and think of your own examples of primary and secondary sources. Be sure to think through the difference. So primary, the person experienced the event. Secondary, they did not. So take some time and jot down some examples, and we'll be talking about these tomorrow.